They say blood is thicker than water, that family protects family. What a cruel joke. Because it was my own blood, my own brother, who destroyed my childhood one horrific night at a time. And when I finally gave birth to his child, my father sold that innocent baby like livestock at an auction. My name is Rebecca Martinez, but most folks around here just call me Miss Becca. I'm 68 years old now, sitting here in my small apartment in Phoenix, Arizona on this scorching August afternoon. For over 5 decades, I've carried a secret so dark, so twisted, that speaking it out loud feels like swallowing broken glass. But today, I'm finally ready to tell you the truth about what happened in that cursed house in Riverside, California, back in the 1970s. This isn't a pretty story. It's the kind that makes your stomach turn, that makes you want to look away. But I need to tell it because somewhere out there might be a girl going through what I went through, thinking she's completely alone in this world. And maybe, just maybe, my words will give her the strength to survive what seems impossible to survive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was born in 1955 in Riverside, California, during a time when children were meant to be seen and not heard, especially girls. Girls were supposed to be grateful, obedient, and quiet. We lived in a faded yellow house on Magnolia Street, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, but somehow, the worst secrets stayed buried behind closed doors. The house itself seemed innocent enough from the outside. 2 stories, a small front porch, and a dying oak tree in the yard that cast long, ominous shadows across the windows. But inside those walls lived a darkness that would shape the rest of my life. 3 bedrooms upstairs. 1 for my parents, 1 for my brother Marcus, and 1 for me. Though those bedroom walls might as well have been made of paper for all the protection they offered. My father, Vincent Martinez, was a foreman at the local steel plant. He was one of those men who believed his word was law, that women existed to serve, and that might made right. At 6'2" with hands like sledgehammers, Vincent commanded respect through fear. He had this way of looking at you that could freeze your blood, cold gray eyes that seemed to see right through you, calculating your worth like you were inventory in his warehouse. Vincent worked long shifts at the plant, coming home every evening reeking of motor oil and cigarettes, his work boots heavy on the wooden floors. When he was in a good mood, he'd ignore me completely. When he was in a bad mood, well, that's when everyone in the house learned to disappear. He had a particular hatred for weakness, and in his mind, being female was the ultimate weakness. My mother, Carmen Martinez, was a tiny woman with prematurely gray hair that she kept in a tight bun. She'd been beautiful once. You could see it in old photographs hidden in her jewelry box, but years of marriage to Vincent had worn her down to a shadow. She took in sewing to make extra money, spending her days hunched over an old Singer machine, mending other people's clothes while her own spirit slowly unraveled. Carmen was terrified of Vincent. We all were. But she tried, in her quiet way, to protect me when she could. "Stay in your room when Papa comes home angry," she'd whisper, pressing a piece of bread into my hand. "Keep your head down, Mija, it'll pass." Always telling me it would pass, as if Vincent's rage was just weather we had to endure. Then there was Marcus. My brother, 3 years older than me, with the kind of dark good looks that made all the neighborhood girls giggle when he walked by. Where I had inherited our mother's small frame and brown eyes, Marcus got our father's height and strong jaw. Everyone said he was the spitting image of Vincent in his younger days, handsome, charming, and completely rotten to the core. From the time I was small, maybe 6 or 7, Marcus had this way of looking at me that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the way brothers were supposed to look at sisters. There was something hungry in his dark eyes, something that made me want to hide under my covers and never come out. But when I tried to tell our mother about the strange feeling Marcus gave me, she'd just shake her head. "Don't be silly, Rebecca. Marcus loves you. He's your big brother. He's supposed to look after you. Look after me." If only she knew how Marcus interpreted that responsibility. The first time I really understood something was wrong, I was 8 years old. It was a Saturday morning in the spring of 1963, and our parents had gone to the farmer's market downtown. Marcus was supposed to be watching me, making sure I didn't get into trouble while they were gone. I was in the living room, playing with my few dolls on the braided rug, when Marcus appeared in the doorway. He was different that day. Usually he ignored me or made fun of my games, calling them stupid and babyish, but that morning he sat down on the couch and just watched me play. The silence stretched on until I finally looked up at him. "What are you staring at?" I asked, my 8-year-old voice filled with annoyance. Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse before pouncing. "You're getting prettier, Rebecca, you know that?" I didn't know what to say to that. Boys my age thought girls had cooties, and here was my teenage brother telling me I was pretty. It felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on why. "Come here," he said, patting the couch beside him. "Come sit with your big brother." I hesitated. Something in his voice, in the way he was looking at me, set off alarm bells in my 8-year-old brain. But he was my brother, and I'd been taught to obey. So I climbed up onto the couch, keeping as much distance between us as possible. Marcus shifted closer, closing the gap I'd tried to maintain. "You know I love you, right, Rebecca? You're my special little sister." He put his arm around me, pulling me against his side. His hand was warm through my thin cotton dress, and I could smell the strange, musky scent that seemed to follow teenage boys everywhere. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Don't be scared," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "I just want to show you something special that only big brothers and little sisters do." His hand started moving, sliding down from my shoulder toward places that no one had ever touched before. I knew, even at 8 years old, that this was wrong. Everything in my body screamed that this was wrong. "No," I said, trying to squirm away. "I don't want to, let me go." But Marcus was bigger, stronger. His other hand clamped over my mouth. "Shh," he hissed. "Be quiet, or I'll tell Papa you were being bad. You know what happens to bad girls, don't you?" I knew. I'd seen what happened when Vincent thought someone in the house had misbehaved. The bruises on our mother's arms, the way she'd wince when she moved wrong. I'd never been on the receiving end of his fury, but I'd watched enough to know I never wanted to be. So I stayed quiet, while Marcus's hands explored places they shouldn't have explored. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood, trying not to cry, trying not to make a sound. This was my brother, the person who was supposed to protect me, and he was… I didn't have words for what he was doing. I was 8 years old in 1963. Nobody talked to children about these things back then. All I knew was that it felt awful and wrong, and I wanted it to stop. When we heard our parents' car pulling into the driveway, Marcus immediately let go of me and moved to the other end of the couch. He picked up a magazine and started flipping through it as if nothing had happened. "Remember," he said without looking at me, "this is our secret. If you tell anyone at all, I'll make sure Papa knows what a bad girl you've been. And you know Papa doesn't like bad girls." I ran to my room and hid under my bed until supper time, my whole body shaking with confusion and fear. I wanted to tell our mother what had happened, but Marcus's threat echoed in my head. What if Papa really would think it was my fault? What if he believed I had been bad? That night at dinner, I could barely eat. Every time I looked at Marcus across the table, he'd catch my eye and smile that horrible smile. Our parents didn't notice anything wrong, or if they did, they didn't care enough to ask. From that day forward, Marcus started finding excuses to be alone with me. When our parents went to church, they never made him go, claiming he was too old for such things. When our mother went to the grocery store, when our father worked late. Always when no one else was around to see. Namrachihia chachur. The touching got worse over the months that followed. More invasive, more frightening. Marcus seemed to delight in my fear, in the way I'd freeze up when he entered a room. He'd corner me in the hallway between bedrooms, in the basement when I was sent to fetch something from storage, even in the bathroom when I thought I was safe behind a locked door. "Locks don't keep me out, little sister," he'd say, holding up the screwdriver he'd used to pop the simple door lock. "Nothing keeps me out." By the time I turned 9 in the fall of 1964, I'd learned to move through the house like a ghost, always listening for Marcus's footsteps, always looking for escape routes. I developed an uncanny ability to sense when he was in hunting mode, when that predatory look would creep into his eyes and I'd know I needed to disappear. But you can't hide forever in a house with only so many rooms. The worst part wasn't even what Marcus did to me, though that was horrible enough. The worst part was the complete isolation. I couldn't tell our mother because she was already drowning in her own fears. I couldn't tell our father because Marcus had made it clear that Vincent would blame me, not him. There were no guidance counselors at school, no trusted adults who seemed safe enough to approach with such a shameful secret. Tachi howls. So I learned to live with it. I learned to disconnect my mind from my body when Marcus's hands wandered where they shouldn't. I learned to stare at the ceiling and count ceiling tiles or recite multiplication tables in my head while he did things that made me feel dirty and broken. I learned to hate the sound of my own name when he said it, the way Rebecca sounded like a curse word coming from his lips. I learned to dread weekends and school holidays, when he'd be home more often. I learned that begging and crying only seemed to excite him more, so I taught myself to go stone still and silent, hoping he'd get bored and leave me alone faster. But Marcus never got bored. If anything, my withdrawal only seemed to fuel his interest. He'd whisper awful things while he touched me, tell me how this was normal, how all brothers and sisters did this, how I was lucky he was teaching me these things. "You're going to thank me someday," he'd say, his breath hot and disgusting against my neck. "When you're older and you understand what this is all about, you're going to be grateful I taught you properly." I didn't feel grateful. I felt sick and scared and utterly alone. The house on Magnolia Street became my prison, and Marcus became my jailer. Our parents were either oblivious to what was happening right under their noses, or they simply chose not to see it. Vincent was too wrapped up in his work and his drinking to pay attention to his children, unless we annoyed him. Carmen was too beaten down by her own survival to have energy left over for protecting her daughter. And so the abuse continued, week after week, month after month. Marcus got bolder as I got older, more confident that I wouldn't tell anyone his secrets. He was right, of course. Who would have believed me? Who would have chosen an 8-year-old girl's word over that of the charming, handsome teenage boy who helped neighbors with their yard work and got good grades in school? By the time I turned 10 in 1965, I'd already learned more about shame and helplessness than most adults ever would. I'd learned that family could be your biggest threat, that home could be the most dangerous place in the world, and that sometimes the monsters don't hide under your bed. Sometimes they sleep in the room right next to yours. But this was only the beginning of my nightmare. What came next would make those early years of touching and groping seem almost innocent by comparison. Marcus was growing up, his teenage body changing, his desires becoming more specific and more dangerous. And I was growing up too, my child's body beginning to show the first signs of the woman I would become. Signs that Marcus noticed with a hunger that terrified me more than anything he'd done before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The summer I turned 11, everything changed. Not because Marcus suddenly developed a conscience, God knows that never happened, but because his appetite grew darker, more demanding. It was 1966, and the world outside our house was exploding with change. The Beatles were singing about love, young people were protesting wars, and women were starting to demand rights. But inside the yellow house on Magnolia Street, I was still trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Marcus had just turned 14 that June, and with adolescence came a cruel confidence that chilled me to the bone. Where before he'd been somewhat secretive about his abuse, now he seemed almost proud of it, like he was claiming territory that belonged to him by right. The first sign of this new boldness came on a Tuesday evening in July. Our father was working a double shift at the plant. Overtime meant extra money, and Vincent never passed up extra money. Our mother had gone to her sister's house across town to help with a new baby, leaving me alone with Marcus for the entire evening. I knew I was in trouble the moment I heard our mother's car pull out of the driveway. Marcus appeared in my bedroom doorway almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting and watching. But something was different about him this time. Instead of the sneaky, furtive demeanor he usually wore during his attacks, he seemed almost relaxed. "Well, well," he said, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Looks like it's just you and me tonight, little sister." I was sitting on my bed, trying to read a library book about horses. Anything to escape into a world that didn't include Marcus and his wandering hands. But the words on the page blurred as panic set in. "Mama will be back soon," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. Carmen would be gone for hours, helping with the baby and probably grateful for any excuse to stay away from this house. Marcus laughed, a sound that made my stomach clench with fear. "No, she won't. Aunt Sophia's baby is colicky. Mama will be there all night, probably until tomorrow morning." He stepped into my room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a prison cell locking. "Which gives us plenty of time to talk." I scrambled backward on the bed until my back hit the headboard. "I don't want to talk. Please, Marcus, just leave me alone." "Leave you alone?" His voice carried a mock hurt that would have been laughable if I hadn't been so terrified. "But Rebecca, I'm your big brother. It's my job to take care of you, to teach you things." His dark eyes glittered with something that made my skin crawl. "And tonight, I'm going to teach you something very special." What happened next was worse than anything Marcus had done before. Not just the physical violation, though that was horrific enough, but the way he talked throughout it all, explaining what he was doing as if he were giving me a biology lesson. He spoke about my changing body with a clinical detachment that somehow made everything more terrible, more wrong. "You're growing up, Rebecca," he said, his voice maddeningly calm while I sobbed into my pillow. "Your body is starting to change, and you need to understand what that means. What it means for you and what it means for me." I tried to block out his words, tried to disappear into my mind the way I'd learned to do. But Marcus wouldn't let me escape this time. He grabbed my chin, forcing me to look at him. "Pay attention," he hissed. "This is important. You're going to be a woman soon, and when that happens, you're going to understand that this," he gestured to what he was doing to me, "this is natural. This is what men and women do." "We're not men and women," I whispered through my tears. "We're brother and sister." Marcus's smile was cold and cruel. "Blood doesn't matter, Rebecca. What matters is that you belong to me. You've always belonged to me, from the day you were born. And now that you're getting older, it's time you learned exactly what that means." The assault lasted for what felt like hours. When it was finally over, Marcus sat on the edge of my bed, calmly putting his clothes back on as if nothing momentous had just happened. I curled up in a ball, my whole body aching, my mind struggling to process what had just occurred. "This is going to be our new normal," Marcus said conversationally, running a hand through his dark hair. "Now that you're old enough to understand, we don't have to play games anymore. We can be honest about what this relationship really is." I stared at him in horror. "What relationship? You're my brother." "I'm your brother, yes, but I'm also the man who's going to take care of you for the rest of your life." His voice carried an absolute certainty that terrified me more than his violence had. "Papa doesn't care about you. You're just another mouth to feed as far as he's concerned. And Mama, well, she's too weak to protect anyone, including herself. But me? I'll always take care of you, Rebecca, as long as you're good to me." The threat in his words was crystal clear. Be good to him, submit to his abuse, or lose even the minimal protection his presence in the house provided. From that night forward, Marcus's assaults became more frequent and more violent. It was as if crossing that line had unleashed something in him that had been barely contained before. He no longer bothered to wait for perfect opportunities when our parents were gone for hours. Instead, he'd corner me whenever he felt like it. When our father was in the shower, when our mother was hanging laundry in the backyard, even when they were just in another room. "They won't hear if you're quiet," he'd whisper in my ear as he pushed me into dark corners. "And you are going to be quiet, aren't you, Rebecca?" I learned to be silent in ways I never knew possible. Silent tears, silent screams, silent prayers to a God who seemed to have forgotten I existed. The house that had never felt like home now felt like a hunting ground, with me as the perpetual prey. School became my only refuge, but even that sanctuary was tainted by the knowledge that I'd have to go home eventually. I started staying after school for any activity I could find, helping teachers clean chalkboards, organizing library books, anything to delay the inevitable return to Magnolia Street. But teachers began to notice my reluctance to leave, my desperate volunteering for extra work. "Is everything all right at home, Rebecca?" Mrs. Patterson, my 5th grade teacher, asked one afternoon as I slowly gathered my books. "You seem troubled lately." For a moment, I was tempted to tell her everything. Mrs. Patterson was kind, with gentle blue eyes and a soft voice that made me think she might actually listen, might actually believe me. But then I remembered Marcus's threats, remembered the consequences he'd promised if I ever told anyone our secret. "Everything's fine," I lied, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass on my face. "I just like helping out." Mrs. Patterson didn't look convinced, but she didn't push the issue. Adults rarely did in those days. Children's problems were family problems, and family problems were private matters that outsiders didn't interfere with. At home, the dynamic between our parents began to shift in ways that made my situation even worse. Vincent, never particularly interested in his children to begin with, seemed to be withdrawing further into his work and his drinking. He'd come home from the plant, eat dinner in silence, then disappear into the garage with a bottle of whiskey and his transistor radio. Our mother, Carmen, was falling apart more visibly with each passing week. The constant stress of living with Vincent's volatile temper, combined with whatever maternal instincts were telling her something was wrong with her daughter, was wearing her down to nothing. She'd developed a tremor in her hands that made her sewing work increasingly difficult, and I'd often catch her staring off into space with tears in her eyes. "Mama," I said one evening, finding her sitting at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, "are you okay?" She looked up at me with hollow eyes that seemed to see right through me. "I'm fine, Mija, just tired." She reached out to touch my face, her trembling fingers cool against my cheek. Are you happy, Rebecca?" The question caught me off guard. Happy? I barely remembered what happiness felt like. Yes, Mama, I'm fine." Carmen studied my face for a long moment, and I had the terrifying feeling that she could see the truth written there. But then Marcus walked into the kitchen, and whatever moment of connection we might have had shattered like dropped glass. "What are you two talking about?" Marcus asked, his voice casual but his eyes sharp as they moved between our mother and me. "Nothing important," Carmen said quickly, her gaze dropping to her lap. "Just girl talk." Marcus smiled that cold smile of his. "Girl talk, huh? Well, don't let me interrupt." But he didn't leave. Instead, he sat down at the table with us, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the room. I excused myself as quickly as possible, but not before catching the look that passed between Marcus and our mother. It was brief, but I saw something in Carmen's eyes that made my blood run cold. Not just fear, but a terrible, guilty knowledge. She knew. Maybe not the details, maybe not the full extent of what Marcus was doing to me, but she knew something was happening. And she was choosing to do nothing about it. That realization hit me harder than any of Marcus's physical assaults. The person who was supposed to protect me, who was supposed to fight for me, was instead looking the other way because facing the truth was too difficult, too dangerous for her own fragile existence. I was truly alone. As autumn approached and I started 6th grade, Marcus's behavior became even bolder. He'd find excuses to touch me in front of our parents, a hand on my shoulder that lingered too long, fingers that accidentally brushed against parts of my body they shouldn't touch. Our parents either didn't notice or pretended not to notice, and Marcus's confidence grew with each ignored transgression. "See how easy this is?" he whispered to me one evening as we sat at the dinner table. Our father was reading his newspaper, our mother was picking at her food, and Marcus's hand was on my thigh under the table, squeezing hard enough to leave bruises. "They don't want to see what's right in front of them. That means I can do whatever I want to you whenever I want." To prove his point, his hand moved higher, his fingers pressing against me through my dress. I couldn't make a sound, couldn't pull away without drawing attention, couldn't do anything but sit there and endure it, while our parents chatted about Vincent's work schedule just 3 feet away. The worst part was that Marcus was right. Our parents had erected such powerful walls of denial around themselves that he could have probably assaulted me right there at the dinner table, and they would have found a way to rationalize it or ignore it entirely. But Marcus wasn't content with just the dinner table games. His nighttime visits to my room became a regular occurrence, sometimes multiple times per week. He'd slip in after everyone else was asleep, his footsteps silent on the old wooden floors, and I'd wake up to find him standing over my bed like some kind of nightmare made flesh. "Wake up, little sister," he'd whisper, and I'd know that the next few hours would be filled with pain and humiliation, and the desperate hope that it would end soon. He started bringing things to these nighttime sessions, tools and objects that made the abuse more painful, more degrading. He seemed to delight in my tears, in the small sounds of pain I couldn't quite suppress, despite my efforts to stay silent. "You're getting stronger," he'd say afterward, as I lay there bleeding and broken. "Most girls your age couldn't handle what you just took. You should be proud." Proud. The word was so obscene in that context that it made me want to laugh and scream at the same time. Eba. By the time winter arrived, I'd stopped sleeping properly. Even when Marcus didn't visit my room, I'd lie awake listening for his footsteps, my body tense and ready to flee even though there was nowhere to run. The exhaustion made everything worse. My grades started slipping, I got sick more often, and the dark circles under my eyes became so pronounced that even my distracted parents occasionally commented on them. "You look tired, Mija," Carmen would say, but when I'd try to tell her that I couldn't sleep, that I was afraid, she'd just give me warm milk and tell me to pray harder. Prayer. As if God was listening to anything that happened in that house of horrors. The truth was that I'd already stopped believing in God, stopped believing in justice, stopped believing in the possibility that anyone would ever come to save me. All I believed in was survival, in making it through each day and each night, and hoping that somehow, someday, I'd find a way out of the hell my life had become. But I was only 11 years old, trapped in a house with a monster who had convinced everyone around us that he was golden, that he could do no wrong. And with each passing day, Marcus was growing bolder, more violent, more possessive. The worst was yet to come, and deep down, I think I already knew it. The spring of 1967 brought changes to our house that I couldn't have anticipated. I had just turned 12, and my body was beginning to betray me in ways that made Marcus's eyes light up with a hunger that terrified me. But it wasn't just my physical development that was shifting. The entire atmosphere in our home was becoming more toxic, more dangerous, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Vincent had been passed over for a promotion at the steel plant, and his drinking had increased dramatically. Where before he'd been content to disappear into the garage with his whiskey, now he was bringing his rage into the house itself. The sound of breaking dishes became commonplace, and Carmen started wearing long sleeves even in the heat to hide the bruises that bloomed like purple flowers on her arms. "You're worthless," I heard him scream at her one night, his voice carrying through the thin walls. 20 years I've been carrying this family, and what do I have to show for it? A weak wife and 2 useless kids. 2 useless kids. Even though I knew Vincent barely acknowledged my existence most days, hearing him dismiss me so casually still stung. But it was Marcus's reaction to our father's increasing violence that truly worried me. Instead of being cowed by Vincent's rages like the rest of us, Marcus seemed energized by them. He'd watch our father terrorize our mother with a calculating interest, as if he were taking notes. And afterward, when Vincent had stormed off to his garage workshop, Marcus would find me. "See how weak she is?" He'd whisper, cornering me in the hallway while our mother sobbed in the kitchen. "See how she just takes it? That's what happens to women who don't have a man to really take care of them." His hand would find my throat, not squeezing hard enough to cut off my air, but just enough to remind me of his strength. "Lucky for you, little sister, you've got me." The dynamic between Vincent and Marcus was shifting too. in ways that made my skin crawl. Vincent had always favored his son, the golden boy who played football and got decent grades and charmed the neighbors. But now there was something else in the way Vincent looked at Marcus. A recognition of shared cruelty that made me want to hide under my bed and never come out. "That boy's got real potential," Vincent said one evening at dinner, after Marcus had regaled us with a story about beating up a smaller kid at school. "Knows how to handle himself, how to take what he wants. That's what it takes to be a real man in this world." Carmen kept her eyes on her plate, but I saw her wince. I think she was beginning to understand what kind of men she was living with, what kind of monster she had helped create by staying silent all these years. But it was what happened on a rainy Thursday evening in May that truly showed me how far both Vincent and Marcus were willing to go. I was in my room, supposedly doing homework, but actually just staring at the math problems on the page while trying to ignore the sounds of another fight downstairs. Vincent was screaming about money again, about bills that couldn't be paid, about Carmen's worthless sewing work not bringing in enough income. The yelling stopped suddenly, which somehow felt more ominous than the noise had been. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, 2 sets of them, heavy and deliberate. My bedroom door opened without a knock, and both Vincent and Marcus walked in. I'd never seen my father in my room before. In all my 12 years, he had never once crossed the threshold of what I'd foolishly thought of as my private space. But there he was, his gray eyes scanning my small domain with the same cold calculation he used when evaluating machinery at the plant. "Stand up," he said simply. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Marcus was leaning against the doorframe, watching the scene with that horrible smile of his. Vincent walked around me slowly, like a buyer examining livestock. I felt his gaze taking in every detail of my developing body, and the nausea that rose in my throat was so strong I had to swallow hard to keep from vomiting. "She's filling out," Vincent said to Marcus as if I weren't standing right there. "Won't be long before she's useful." Useful. The word hit me like a physical blow. Whatever this was about, whatever sick game they were playing, I knew it meant nothing good for me. "I've been taking care of her, Papa," Marcus said, and there was something almost prideful in his voice, making sure she understands her place, her responsibilities. Vincent nodded approvingly. "Good boy. A woman needs to learn early what her role is, what's expected of her." His eyes met mine, and the complete absence of fatherly love in them made me want to scream. "You're going to be a good girl for your brother, aren't you, Rebecca?" I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was closing up, my whole body frozen with terror. "Answer your father," Marcus said sharply. "Yes?" I whispered, the word barely audible. "Yes, what?" Vincent demanded. "Yes, yes, sir." Vincent smiled, but it was the kind of smile a wolf gives before it devours its prey. "That's my girl. Marcus has been teaching you well." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Keep up the good work, son. A man's got to break his horses early if he wants them to be properly trained." After they left, I collapsed onto my bed, my whole body shaking with the realization of what had just happened. My father, my own father, had just given Marcus explicit permission to continue abusing me. More than that, he'd encouraged it, praised it as proper training for a future woman. Walter, I was no longer just being victimized by my brother in secret. Now it was a family enterprise, sanctioned by the head of the household himself. The abuse escalated dramatically after that night. Marcus no longer bothered to be even remotely secretive about what he was doing to me. He'd corner me in the kitchen while our mother washed dishes, his hands roaming over my body while she stood just 10 feet away, her shoulders tense but her attention carefully focused elsewhere. "Mama knows," Marcus whispered in my ear during one of these kitchen encounters. "Papa knows. Everyone knows, and nobody cares enough to stop me. That should tell you everything you need to know about your value in this family." He started bringing friends over, other teenage boys who looked at me with the same predatory hunger that had become so familiar in Marcus's eyes. They'd sit in our living room, drinking the beer that Vincent now openly provided, talking about girls in crude terms while I served them snacks like some kind of domestic servant. "Your sister's getting pretty," one of them, a boy named Danny Kozak with greasy hair and dead eyes, said to Marcus one afternoon. "Real pretty." "Yeah, she is," Marcus replied, his gaze finding mine across the room. "And she's very accommodating." The laughter that followed made my skin crawl. These boys understood exactly what Marcus was implying, and from the way they looked at me, I knew it was only a matter of time before Marcus decided to share his property with his friends. That night, I tried once more to reach out to our mother. I found her in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "Mama," I said softly, sitting down across from her, "I need to tell you something." Carmen looked up at me, and for just a moment, I saw the woman she used to be, the young mother who had sung lullabies and kissed scraped knees. But then, that familiar wall of denial slammed down over her features. "It's late, Mija, you should be in bed." "Please, Mama, it's important." "It's about Marcus, about what he—" "No." The word came out sharp and final. Carmen stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair. "I don't want to hear it. Whatever you think is happening, you're wrong. Marcus is a good boy, and you need to stop making up stories." "I'm not making up stories." The words burst out of me louder than I'd intended. "He's been hurting me, Mama, for years. And now Papa knows, and he doesn't care, and I don't know what to do." Carmen's hand connected with my cheek so fast I didn't see it coming. The slap wasn't hard, but the shock of it, the first time my mother had ever hit me, was devastating. "Enough," she said, her voice trembling. "I won't listen to lies about my son. Marcus loves you. We all love you. And if you can't see that, if you can't be grateful for the family you have, then maybe you don't deserve it." She left me sitting there in the dark kitchen, my cheeks stinging and my heart breaking into pieces so small I didn't think they could ever be put back together. My own mother had chosen to believe that I was a liar rather than accept that her golden boy was a monster. After that conversation, whatever small protection Carmen's presence in the house had provided evaporated completely. She stopped looking at me directly, stopped asking about my day or my schoolwork, stopped acknowledging my existence except when absolutely necessary. It was as if I had become invisible to her, a ghost haunting the edges of her carefully constructed denial. Marcus noticed the change immediately, of course. He had a predator's instinct for weakness, for vulnerability, and my complete isolation was like blood in the water to him. "Looks like Mama's finally figured out the truth," he said the next evening, finding me crying in my room. "She knows what you really are now. Just a little slut who can't keep her mouth shut." "I'm not," I started to protest, but Marcus cut me off with a backhand that split my lip. "Don't lie to me," he snarled. "You tried to turn her against me, tried to make her think I was the bad guy. But she's smarter than that. She knows that good girls don't talk about family business with outsiders." "She's not an outsider, she's our mother." Marcus laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "Your mother? Rebecca, your mother just chose me over you. She had a chance to protect you, to believe you, and instead, she slapped you and called you a liar. That's not a mother, that's just another woman who knows which side her bread is buttered on." The horrible thing was, he was right. Carmen had made her choice, and it wasn't me. Summer arrived with a heat wave that made the house feel like an oven. With school out, I had nowhere to escape to, no teachers to notice my bruises or my desperate silences. I was trapped in that yellow house with my abusers for 16 hours a day, with no relief except for the few precious hours when Vincent and Marcus were both at work. But even those hours weren't safe anymore. Carmen had started leaving the house more often, taking on extra sewing work that required her to visit clients' homes. She claimed it was for the money, but I suspected it was really just to get away from the suffocating atmosphere of our home. "Going to Mrs. Patterson's house," she'd announce, not meeting my eyes. "She's got a whole pile of mending work. I'll be back this evening." And then she'd be gone, leaving me alone with Marcus for entire afternoons. Those were the worst times. With no one else around, no need for even minimal discretion, Marcus's treatment of me became openly savage. He'd hurt me in ways that left marks, then laugh when I tried to hide them. "Who are you hiding them from?" he'd ask. grabbing my arm to examine the finger-shaped bruises he'd left. Papa doesn't care, Mama pretends not to see, and you don't have any friends to notice. Face it, Rebecca, you could be covered in bruises from head to toe and nobody would lift a finger to help you. He was establishing complete dominance, breaking down what little resistance I had left. And it was working. By the end of that summer, I'd stopped fighting back entirely. I'd stopped crying during his assaults. I'd stopped hoping that anyone would save me. I had become exactly what Marcus wanted me to be, a broken doll that he could pose and use however he pleased. But what none of us knew was that my body was about to betray me in a way that would change everything. The changes that had begun that spring were accelerating, and soon there would be consequences to Marcus's abuse that even Vincent's approval couldn't make disappear. The worst part of my nightmare was about to begin, and when it did, I would discover just how far my father was willing to go to protect the family's secrets. September 1967 brought an Indian summer to Riverside, with temperatures soaring past 90 degrees well into what should have been the cooling autumn months. I had just started 7th grade, walking through the halls of Roosevelt Middle School like a ghost among the living. While other 12-year-old girls giggled about boys and complained about homework, I moved through my days in a fog of exhaustion and dread. The abuse at home had reached a level of brutality that left me constantly sore, constantly afraid. Marcus had grown bolder over the summer, more creative in his cruelty. What had once been terrible but brief encounters had evolved into prolonged sessions of torture that sometimes lasted hours. He seemed to delight in finding new ways to hurt me, new boundaries to cross. But it was the changes in my own body that began to terrify me in ways I couldn't fully understand. I'd always been a thin child, small for my age, which Marcus often commented on with disgust. "Scrawny little thing," he'd say, pinching my ribs. Good thing I'm not picky, but lately my clothes weren't fitting the same way. My uniform skirts felt tight around the waist, and I found myself struggling to button the white blouses that had been loose just weeks before. At first, I attributed it to the erratic eating patterns that had become my norm. Some days I couldn't keep food down at all, my stomach churning with anxiety from the moment I woke up. Other days I found myself ravenously hungry, eating everything in sight with a desperation that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside my bones. "You're eating us out of house and home," Vincent complained one evening, watching me polish off a second helping of Carmen's beans and rice. "Where's a skinny little runt like you putting all that food?" I mumbled an apology and excused myself from the table, but Marcus followed me into the kitchen. He cornered me by the sink, his hand sliding over my stomach in a way that made my skin crawl. "Papa's right," he said, his voice thoughtful. "You are getting bigger." His dark eyes narrowed as he studied my face. "When was your last monthly bleeding, Rebecca?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Monthly bleeding, something Carmen had awkwardly explained to me earlier that year when my body first began its transition into womanhood. The cramping, the mess, the shame of it all had been just one more burden to bear in a life already filled with too much pain. But as Marcus's words sank in, as I tried to remember the last time I dealt with that particular misery, a cold dread began to spread through my chest like ice water. I don't remember," I whispered. Marcus's smile was slow and predatory. "Think harder, little sister. Think real hard." I pressed my back against the kitchen counter, my mind racing through the past weeks. The past months. There had been so much pain, so much chaos, that the normal rhythms of my body had become lost in the larger nightmare of my existence. But now, forced to focus, to really remember. It had been over 2 months, maybe 3. "No," I breathed, the word barely audible. "No, that can't." "Oh, but it can," Marcus said, his hand still resting on my stomach. "It absolutely can. In fact, I'd say it was inevitable." He leaned closer, his breath hot against my ear. "Did you really think we could do what we've been doing without consequences?" The kitchen spun around me. I gripped the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles went white, trying to stay upright as the full implication of what Marcus was suggesting crashed over me like a tsunami. Pregnant. I might be pregnant. With my brother's child. "You're lying," I gasped. "You're trying to scare me." Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. Am I? Look at yourself, Rebecca. Really look. The weight gain, the nausea, the fatigue. Your body is telling you the truth, even if your mind doesn't want to accept it. I ran from the kitchen, Marcus's laughter following me as I stumbled up the stairs to my room. I slammed the door behind me and collapsed onto my bed, my whole body shaking with terror and denial. Yay. It couldn't be true. I was 12 years old. Children couldn't have children. It was impossible, unthinkable, a nightmare too horrible to be real. But as I lay there in the gathering darkness, my hands instinctively moved to my stomach. Was it my imagination, or was there a slight roundness there that hadn't been before? A firmness beneath the skin that felt foreign and terrifying. The next few days passed in a blur of sick panic. I found myself studying my reflection obsessively, turning sideways in the bathroom mirror to examine my profile, pressing my hands against my abdomen and trying to convince myself that any changes I noticed were just in my head. But the signs kept mounting. The morning nausea that sent me running to the bathroom before school. The exhaustion that made it nearly impossible to concentrate on my classes. The way my breasts had begun to ache with a tenderness that made it painful to even wear a bra. Most damning of all was Marcus's behavior. He watched me constantly now, his eyes following my every movement with a mixture of fascination and possession that made my skin crawl. He'd find excuses to touch my stomach, his hands lingering there with a proprietary smugness that spoke volumes. "How are you feeling, little sister?" he'd ask with false concern, usually when our parents were within earshot. "You've been looking a bit delicate lately." Carmen, lost in her own world of willful blindness, would occasionally glance up from her sewing with vague worry. "Maybe she's catching a cold. There's something going around at school." "Maybe," Marcus would agree, but his eyes would be locked on mine, and we both knew exactly what was really happening. 2 weeks into October, I couldn't deny it anymore. The changes in my body were too pronounced, too consistent with everything I'd heard whispered about pregnancy in the girls' bathroom at school. My uniform skirt wouldn't zip properly, and I'd taken to wearing my father's oversized sweaters to hide the growing evidence. I was pregnant, 12 years old, and pregnant with my brother's child. The realization brought with it a despair so profound that I seriously considered throwing myself down the stairs, walking into traffic, anything to make the nightmare stop. But alongside the despair was something else, a strange protective instinct that I didn't fully understand. There was something growing inside me, something innocent and helpless that hadn't asked to be created this way. And despite the horrible circumstances of its conception, despite the fact that its very existence threatened to destroy what little remained of my life, I found myself unable to wish it harm. It was during lunch period on a gray Thursday in late October that my secret was finally exposed. I was sitting alone in the cafeteria. I'd had no friends for months, no energy to maintain the pretense of normalcy that relationships required, when a wave of nausea hit me so hard, I barely made it to the girls' bathroom before vomiting violently. Mrs. Henderson, the school nurse, found me there 20 minutes later, still hunched over the toilet and retching despite having nothing left in my stomach. "Rebecca, honey, what's wrong?" Her voice was kind, genuinely concerned in a way I hadn't heard from an adult in so long it almost made me cry. "I'm fine," I managed to whisper, the automatic lie coming easily despite my obvious distress. Just sick." Mrs. Henderson helped me to her office, settled me on the cot, and brought me a cup of water. She was a woman in her 50s, gray-haired and grandmotherly, with sharp eyes that seemed to see more than most adults bothered to look for. "How long have you been feeling sick like this?" she asked, pulling up a chair beside the cot. "Just today," I lied, but my voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Henderson studied me for a long moment, her gaze taking in my pale complexion, the dark circles under my eyes, the way my clothes hung strangely on my changing body. "Rebecca," she said gently, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. When was your last menstrual period?" The question hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. I stared at her, my heart hammering so hard I was sure she could hear it. I don't." I stammered, but the words wouldn't come. "It's okay," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice remaining calm and professional. "I'm not here to judge you, honey. I'm here to help. But I need to know the truth." Something in her tone, in the genuine compassion I heard there, broke through the walls I'd built around myself. For the first time in months, I felt like I was talking to someone who might actually care about what happened to me. I think," I whispered, the words barely audible. "I think I might be pregnant." The admission hung in the air like a confession of murder. Mrs. Henderson's expression didn't change, but I saw something shift in her eyes, a hardening that spoke of conclusions being drawn, of pieces falling into place. "I see," she said quietly. "And the father? Is he someone at school?" I shook my head mutely, unable to speak the truth but equally unable to lie convincingly. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward slightly. "Rebecca, is someone at home hurting you?" The question was asked so gently, with such careful compassion, that it almost broke me completely. For a moment I was tempted to tell her everything, about Marcus, about Vincent's approval, about Carmen's willful blindness. For a moment, I thought about what it would be like to have an adult who actually wanted to protect me. But then reality crashed back down. What could Mrs. Henderson do? Call the police? Contact social services? Even if they believed me, and why would they believe a pregnant 12-year-old over a charming teenage boy and his respectable family? What then? Foster care? An institution? And what about the baby growing inside me? "No," I whispered, the lie tasting like poison on my tongue. "No one's hurting me." Mrs. Henderson's eyes told me she didn't believe it, but she also knew better than to push too hard. Instead, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a business card. "This is the number for a clinic downtown," she said, pressing the card into my hand. "They help girls in difficult situations. They can give you options, help you figure out what to do next. Options." The word seemed almost foreign to me. When had I ever had options? "I need to call your parents," Mrs. Henderson continued. "This isn't something we can keep secret." "Please," I begged, panic flooding through me. "Please don't call them. Not yet. I need time to think." Mrs. Henderson looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. Professional protocol demanded that she contact my parents immediately. But something in my terror, in my desperate pleading, gave her pause. "I can give you until tomorrow," she said finally. "But Rebecca, this isn't going away. You're going to need help, medical care, people who can support you through this." I nodded, clutching the business card like a lifeline, even though I knew I'd never have the courage to use it. Tissé, that evening at home, I moved through dinner like a sleepwalker. Every bite of food felt like swallowing rocks, and I could feel Marcus's eyes on me constantly, studying my face for signs of what had happened at school. "You look pale," Carmen observed, her voice carrying the distant concern of someone commenting on the weather. "Maybe you should go to bed early." "Good idea," Vincent grunted without looking up from his newspaper. "Can't have you getting the whole house sick." But as I started to leave the table, Marcus caught my arm. "Walk with me, little sister," he said, his grip just tight enough to hurt. "I want to talk to you." He led me out to the backyard, to the shadows behind Vincent's workshop where no one could overhear us. The October night was cold, and I shivered in my thin sweater, but Marcus seemed oblivious to the temperature. "Something happened at school today," he said, "and it wasn't a question. I can see it in your face." I tried to deny it, but Marcus grabbed my chin, forcing me to look at him. "Don't lie to me, Rebecca. I always know when you're lying." His thumb pressed hard against my jaw. Did someone notice? Did someone ask questions? The fear in his voice surprised me. For the first time since this nightmare began, Marcus seemed genuinely worried about consequences, about discovery. "The nurse," I whispered. She thinks I might be pregnant." Marcus's grip tightened, and for a moment I thought he might hit me. But then his expression shifted, becoming calculating rather than angry. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing. I didn't tell her anything about you." He studied my face in the dim light, searching for deception. Finally, he released my chin and stepped back. "Good girl," he said, his voice carrying a note of approval that made me feel sick. "That's very good. Because if you had told her the truth, if you had tried to cause trouble for this family—" He let the threat hang unfinished, but we both knew what he meant. "But we have a problem now," Marcus continued, beginning to pace back and forth in the small space. "People are going to notice. There are going to be questions. And we need to be ready with the right answers." "What do you mean?" Marcus stopped pacing and looked at me with that cold smile I'd learned to fear. "I mean, little sister, that it's time for you to get a boyfriend." Marcus's words hung in the cold October air like a death sentence. A boyfriend. The idea was so absurd, so twisted, that I almost laughed despite the terror coursing through my veins. I was 12 years old, pregnant with my brother's child, and he was talking about finding me a boyfriend to pin the blame on. "You're crazy," I whispered, wrapping my arms around myself as much for emotional protection as for warmth. "No one will believe that. I don't even talk to boys at school." Marcus's smile widened, and I saw that familiar gleam of cruel intelligence in his dark eyes. "That's about to change, little sister. Because starting tomorrow, you're going to become very interested in boys. Specifically, one boy." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. In the dim light from our neighbor's porch, I could make out what looked like a school photograph. "Tommy Brennan," Marcus said, showing me the picture of a boy who looked maybe 14 or 15, with sandy hair and a nervous smile. "Sophomore, at the high school. Lives on the other side of town with his drunk father. No mother in the picture." I stared at the photograph, confusion mixing with my fear. "I don't understand. How do you even know this boy?" "I know lots of things, Rebecca. I make it my business to know things." Marcus folded the photo and tucked it back into his pocket. "Tommy Brennan is what you might call a troubled kid. Gets into fights, skips school, runs with a rough crowd. The kind of boy that decent families warn their daughters to stay away from." The pieces of Marcus's twisted plan were beginning to fall into place, and the picture they formed made my stomach turn. "You want me to say he's the father?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not just say it," Marcus corrected. "You're going to make everyone believe it. You're going to tell them that you've been sneaking around with Tommy Brennan for months, that he convinced you to experiment, that you were too ashamed to tell anyone because you knew how disappointed your family would be." I shook my head frantically. "No one will believe that. I've never even spoken to this boy." "They'll believe it because they'll want to believe it," Marcus said with chilling certainty. "People always prefer a simple story to a complicated truth. A good girl who got led astray by a bad boy? That's a story they can understand, a story that doesn't threaten their comfortable assumptions about how the world works." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper I'd learned to fear. "But a girl being violated by her own brother, with her father's knowledge and approval? That's a story that would force them to question everything they think they know about families like ours. And people hate having their worldview challenged, Rebecca. They'll choose the lie every single time." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down I knew he wasn't. I had seen how quickly Mrs. Henderson had backed down when I denied being hurt at home. How readily adults accepted simple explanations rather than digging deeper into uncomfortable truths. "What about Tommy?" I asked. "What if he denies it?" Marcus's laugh was cold and sharp. "Tommy Brennan has been in trouble with the law 3 times this year. Shoplifting, vandalism, drunk and disorderly. His word against yours. Against the word of a pregnant 12-year-old from a respectable family?" He shook his head. "Nobody's going to believe him, especially when we provide them with evidence." "Evidence?" "Letters," Marcus said simply. "Love letters from you to Tommy, describing your secret relationship. I've already started writing them. You're going to copy them over in your handwriting, and then we're going to make sure they're found in all the right places." The calculated nature of his plan terrified me more than his violence ever had. This wasn't random cruelty or uncontrolled rage. This was methodical, systematic destruction of an innocent boy's life, all to cover up Marcus's crimes. "I won't do it," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I won't lie about some innocent boy." Marcus's hand shot out faster than I could react, grabbing me by the throat and slamming me back against the wall of the workshop. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I gasped for air while his fingers tightened around my neck. "You'll do exactly what I tell you to do," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure that everyone knows what a little slut you are. I'll tell them how you seduced me, how you begged for it, how you threatened to hurt yourself if I didn't give you what you wanted." His grip tightened, cutting off my air supply just enough to send panic racing through my system. And you know what? They'll believe that too. Because it's easier to believe that a 12-year-old girl is a manipulative seductress than it is to believe that her 17-year-old brother is a rapist. He released me suddenly, and I collapsed against the wall, coughing and gasping. Marcus straightened his jacket as if nothing had happened. "Besides," he continued conversationally, "this plan protects everyone. Tommy Brennan was already headed for a life of crime and failure. This just accelerates the timeline a little. But you get to keep your secret, keep your family intact, and our baby gets to grow up without the stigma of unusual parentage. Our baby." The possessive way he said it made my skin crawl, but it also drove home a horrifying realization. In Marcus's mind, this wasn't a crisis to be managed or a problem to be solved. This was a triumph, a victory that proved his complete dominance over me. "Now," Marcus said, pulling the photograph out again and pressing it into my trembling hands, "you're going to take this home and study it. Learn everything about Tommy Brennan's face. Memorize every detail. Because starting tomorrow, you're going to be madly in love with him." The next morning at school, I could barely concentrate on my classes. The photograph was burning a hole in my backpack, and Marcus's plan echoed in my head like a toxic mantra. I found myself scanning the hallways during class changes, looking for any sign of the boy whose life I was about to destroy. Mrs. Henderson stopped me on my way to lunch, her concerned eyes studying my face with professional assessment. "How are you feeling today, Rebecca?" "Better," I lied, forcing a weak smile. "I think it was just a stomach bug." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "Remember what I told you yesterday? The offer still stands if you need help." For a moment, I was tempted to tell her everything. About Marcus, about the pregnancy, about the innocent boy who was about to be framed for crimes he'd never committed. But then I remembered Marcus's hands around my throat, his calm certainty that no one would believe the truth over a comfortable lie. "Thank you," I said instead. "But everything's fine, really." That afternoon, as I walked home from school, I finally saw him. Tommy Brennan was standing outside the corner market with two other boys, smoking cigarettes and laughing at something one of them had said. He was taller than he'd looked in the photograph, with the kind of lean build that suggested he was still growing into his height. I stood across the street, pretending to wait for the bus while I studied his face. He looked younger than 17, despite his height. There was something almost innocent about his laugh, something that reminded me painfully of the childhood I'd lost so many years ago. This was the boy whose life Marcus planned to destroy. This laughing, careless teenager who had no idea that his fate was being decided by people he'd never met, for crimes he'd never committed. I made it 3 blocks toward home before I had to stop and vomit in the gutter, my body rejecting not just the pregnancy hormones but the moral poison of what I was being forced to participate in. When I finally made it home, Marcus was waiting for me in the kitchen with a stack of notebooks and a pen. "Time to get started," he said, settling into the chair beside me. "We've got letters to write." For the next 3 hours, I sat at that kitchen table and copied out the most twisted love letters I could have imagined. Marcus had crafted them with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else, creating a narrative of secret meetings, stolen kisses, and escalating physical intimacy that painted me as both victim and willing participant. "My darling Tommy," I wrote in my careful 12-year-old handwriting, "I can't stop thinking about what we did behind the gym yesterday. I know we shouldn't be doing these things, but when you touch me, I can't say no." Each word felt like swallowing broken glass. With every sentence, I was building the framework that would destroy an innocent boy and protect the monster sitting beside me. "This is good," Marcus said, reading over my shoulder. Very convincing. You're getting the tone just right. Innocent, but awakening. Curious, but conflicted. When we finally finished, Marcus gathered up the letters and locked them in a box he kept hidden in his room. Phase 1 complete, he said with satisfaction. Tomorrow we start Phase 2. Making sure these letters get into the right hands at exactly the right time. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my hands pressed against my growing belly. Somewhere in the darkness, an innocent boy was sleeping peacefully, unaware that his world was about to be shattered. And somewhere else in this house, a monster was probably planning the next phase of his elaborate deception. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. How do you ask God for forgiveness when you're about to commit a sin that will destroy an innocent person? How do you ask for protection when you're actively participating in someone else's destruction? The baby moved inside me for the first time that night, a tiny flutter that might have been joyful under different circumstances. Instead, it felt like a reminder of the impossible situation I was trapped in, carrying the child of my abuser while preparing to blame its existence on a boy who'd never even spoken to me. Tomorrow, the real deception would begin. Instead, November arrived with a bitter cold that seemed to seep into my bones and stay there. I was now almost 4 months pregnant, and despite my best efforts to hide it, my condition was becoming impossible to conceal. The loose sweaters and baggy clothes that had worked in October were no longer sufficient camouflage for the growing curve of my belly. Marcus's plan was moving forward with clockwork precision. Over the past 3 weeks, he had orchestrated a series of carefully planned discoveries that were slowly building the narrative of my supposed relationship with Tommy Brennan. It started small. A love letter accidentally dropped near my locker where other students would find it. A photograph of Tommy that Marcus had somehow obtained, planted in my backpack where a teacher would discover it during a routine search for contraband. Each piece of evidence was designed to create whispers, to plant seeds of gossip that would eventually grow into accepted truth. People are starting to talk, Marcus informed me one morning as we walked to school together. To any observer, we looked like a caring older brother walking his sister to class. They couldn't see the way his hand gripped my arm just tight enough to leave bruises, or hear the casual cruelty in his voice. Mrs. Patterson mentioned to Carmen yesterday that some of the teachers are concerned about you. Apparently, they think you're involved with an older boy from the high school. His smile was sharp as a blade. Carmen, of course, was shocked. She assured Mrs. Patterson that her daughter would never behave so inappropriately. The irony wasn't lost on me. Our mother was defending my virtue while remaining willfully blind to the fact that her own son had been destroying it for years. "What did you tell her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I played the concerned big brother perfectly," Marcus said, his grip tightening. "Told her I'd been worried about you too, that I'd noticed you acting strange lately. I even suggested that maybe she should have a serious talk with you about the dangers of getting involved with boys before you're ready." That evening, Carmen did exactly what Marcus had predicted she would. She appeared in my bedroom doorway just after dinner, her face pale and anxious. "Rebecca, Misha, we need to talk." I was lying on my bed, supposedly doing homework but actually just staring at the ceiling, and trying not to think about how much worse my situation was getting with each passing day. Carmen sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Your teachers are concerned about you," she began hesitantly. They think you might be involved with an older boy." I forced myself to look surprised, to inject just the right amount of guilty defensiveness into my voice. "What? That's ridiculous." But Carmen's sharp eyes caught the flush that spread across my cheeks, the way I couldn't quite meet her gaze. In that moment, I realized with sick clarity that I was a better actress than I'd ever wanted to be. Years of hiding Marcus's abuse had taught me how to lie convincingly, how to show people exactly what they expected to see. "Rebecca," Carmen said softly, "I know you're growing up. I know that boys are starting to notice you, and you're starting to notice them. But you're so young, Mija. Too young for certain kinds of relationships." If only she knew how young I'd been when those certain kinds of relationships had actually started. If only she knew that her precious son had been molesting me since I was 8 years old. "There's nothing wrong with having crushes," Carmen continued, clearly struggling with a conversation she'd never expected to have with her 12-year-old daughter. But if there's a boy you're interested in, you should talk to your papa and me about it. We want to meet him, to make sure he's a good boy from a good family." The trap was being set perfectly. Marcus had known exactly how this conversation would go, had predicted every word of our mother's awkward speech about appropriate behavior and family values. "There is someone," I said quietly, hating myself for every word. "But I didn't think you'd approve." Carmen's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, concern, and something that might have been relief that I was being honest with her. "Tell me about him," she said gently. So I did. I told her about Tommy Brennan, painting him with Marcus's carefully crafted lies. I described a boy who was older, more mature, who made me feel special and grown up. I talked about secret meetings and stolen kisses, weaving a story that was both innocent enough to be believable and concerning enough to justify my parents' eventual outrage. Carmen listened with growing alarm, her face pale in the lamplight. "This boy," she said when I finished. "How old is he?" 17, I whispered, as if admitting to a terrible sin. Carmen's intake of breath was sharp and audible. "Rebecca, that's far too old for you. A 17-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl. That's not appropriate. That's not safe." "But I love him," I said, forcing tears into my eyes. It wasn't hard. I had plenty of reasons to cry. And he loves me. He says age doesn't matter when two people really care about each other. The words tasted like poison in my mouth. I was quoting directly from one of the letters Marcus had forced me to write, using Tommy's supposed words to justify a relationship that existed only in our twisted fiction. "Oh, Misha," Carmen said, reaching out to stroke my hair. "I know it feels like love, but you're too young to understand what that really means. This boy, if he truly cared about you, he wouldn't be asking you to keep secrets from your family." She was right, of course, but not in the way she thought. "I want to tell your papa about this," Carmen continued. "He needs to know what's happening." I forced myself to look panicked, to grab her arm in apparent desperation. "Please don't tell Papa. He'll be so angry. He'll forbid me from ever seeing Tommy again." "That might be for the best," Carmen said firmly. "You're too young for this kind of relationship, Rebecca. Much too young." But I could see in her eyes that she wasn't going to wait for my permission. She was going to tell Vincent, just as Marcus had known she would. The next evening, Vincent came home from work with the air of a man preparing for battle. He'd obviously been thinking about Carmen's revelation all day, working himself up into the kind of righteous fury that he wore like armor. "Rebecca," he called from the kitchen, his voice carrying that tone of authority that had terrified me since childhood. "Come here, now." I found him sitting at the kitchen table, still in his work clothes, his gray eyes cold as winter steel. Carmen was standing by the stove, nervously stirring a pot of soup that didn't need stirring. Marcus was leaning against the counter, playing his role as the concerned older brother to perfection. "Sit down," Vincent commanded, pointing to the chair across from him. I sat, my hands folded in my lap, trying to look like a guilty child rather than a pregnant victim of incest. "Your mother tells me you've been sneaking around with some boy," Vincent said, his voice deceptively calm. "Some older boy from the high school." "Yes, sir," I whispered. "And you thought it was appropriate to keep this secret from your family?" "No, sir. I was scared you'd be angry." Vincent's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Angry? Rebecca, angry doesn't begin to cover what I'm feeling right now. A 12-year-old girl has no business getting involved with a 17-year-old boy. Do you understand what that makes you look like? What it makes this family look like? Of course. It wasn't concern for my well-being that was driving his rage. It was concern for the family's reputation. I want to know everything," Vincent continued. "How long has this been going on? How did you meet this boy? And more importantly, how far has this relationship progressed?" The questions I'd been dreading, the ones that would force me to build the foundation for the lie that would destroy Tommy Brennan's life. "His name is Tommy," I began, my voice barely audible. "Tommy Brennan. He's a sophomore at the high school." Vincent's eyes narrowed. "Brennan? That drunk Murphy Brennan's kid? I don't know about his father, I lied. I know the family, Vincent said grimly. Trash. The father's a drunk who can't hold down a job, and the boy's been in trouble with the police more than once. He leaned forward, his gaze boring into me. How did you meet him? I told the story Marcus had created, about chance encounters that turned into conversations that turned into secret meetings. I described a gradual seduction that painted me as both victim and willing participant, innocent but curious, manipulated but complicit. With each word, I was building the framework that would eventually destroy an innocent boy's life. And the worst part was how easily the lies came, how naturally I'd learned to weave fiction into something that sounded like truth. And how far, Vincent said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, has this boy taken advantage of you? This was the moment Marcus had prepared me for, the question that would determine whether our deception succeeded or failed. We kissed, I said, my cheeks burning with manufactured shame, and sometimes he would touch me. But we didn't what? Vincent demanded. Didn't go all the way, I whispered, using the euphemism that teenagers whispered about in the school hallways. Vincent stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing this information, deciding whether to believe me. You're telling me, he said slowly, that a 17-year-old boy has been meeting you in secret for months, kissing you and touching you, but it never went beyond that? Yes, sir. And you expect me to believe that? My heart hammered against my ribs. This was the crucial moment, the point where the entire deception could collapse. I told him I wasn't ready, I said, tears beginning to flow for real now. I told him I was too scared, that I'd never done anything like that before. He said he understood, that he would wait until I was ready. It was exactly the kind of thing that would make Vincent's blood boil. The idea of some older boy grooming his daughter, slowly breaking down her resistance while pretending to respect her boundaries. That son of a bitch, Vincent growled, his face flushing red with anger. I'll kill him. I'll fucking kill him. Carmen made a small sound of distress from the stove, but she didn't try to calm her husband down. She knew better than to get between Vincent and his rage. Where does he live? Vincent demanded. Where can I find this piece of trash? I gave him Tommy's address, information that Marcus had somehow obtained through his network of contacts and sources. As I spoke the words, I felt like I was signing an innocent boy's death warrant. But then Marcus stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on Vincent's shoulder. Papa, wait, he said, his voice calm and reasonable. Think about this. If you go over there and beat up that boy, what's that going to accomplish? It'll just create a bigger scandal, draw more attention to our family. Vincent turned to look at his son, his gray eyes still burning with fury but also calculating now. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we handle this smart, Marcus said. We make sure that boy understands he's not welcome around Rebecca anymore, but we do it in a way that protects our family's reputation. And how exactly do we do that? Marcus smiled, and I saw the trap finally snapping shut around Tommy Brennan's unsuspecting life. We go to the police, Marcus said simply. We report that a 17-year-old has been having inappropriate contact with our 12-year-old daughter. We let the law handle him. The room fell silent except for the sound of Carmen's nervous stirring. Vincent stared at Marcus with something approaching pride. That's smart thinking, boy. Real smart. He turned back to me, his expression hard as granite. You're going to tell the police everything. Every meeting, every touch, every inappropriate thing that boy did to you. Do you understand me? I nodded, unable to speak around the lump of guilt and horror lodged in my throat. Good, Vincent said, standing up from the table. We'll go to the station tomorrow after I get off work. And Rebecca? He leaned down until his face was inches from mine. If I find out you're holding anything back, if I discover there's more to this story than you're telling me, you'll wish that boy was the worst thing that ever happened to you. As my family dispersed to their evening routines, I sat alone at the kitchen table, my hands pressed against my growing belly. Tomorrow I would walk into a police station and destroy an innocent boy's life with lies. I would set in motion a chain of events that would brand Tommy Brennan as a predator and a criminal, all to protect the real monster who had been abusing me for years. The baby moved inside me, a tiny flutter of life that seemed to underscore the terrible irony of my situation. I was carrying proof of the real crime, the real abuse, but instead of exposing the truth, I was about to participate in its cover-up. And the worst part was knowing that this was only the beginning. Marcus's plan was working perfectly, but I could see in his eyes that he had bigger moves planned. Darker schemes that would make tonight's deception look simple by comparison. The innocent boy sleeping peacefully across town had no idea that his world was about to end. And the child growing inside me had no idea that its very existence was part of a lie so monstrous it would shape the rest of all our lives. The Riverside police station was a squat, gray building that squatted on 3rd Street like a concrete toad. As Vincent marched me up the front steps that cold November afternoon, my legs felt like they were made of water. Each step brought me closer to the moment when I would destroy an innocent boy's life with carefully rehearsed lies. "Remember what we talked about," Vincent muttered under his breath as we approached the front desk. "Stick to the story. Don't elaborate unless they ask direct questions. And for God's sake, try to look like the victim you're supposed to be." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. I was a victim, just not of the person we were about to accuse. The desk sergeant was a heavy-set man with kind eyes and graying hair, who looked like he might have granddaughters my age. When Vincent explained why we were there, the sergeant's expression shifted from routine professionalism to serious concern. "I see," he said, glancing between Vincent and me. "This is definitely something we need to look into. Let me get Detective Morrison. She handles these kinds of cases." Detective Morrison turned out to be a woman in her 40s, with sharp blue eyes and prematurely silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. She led us to a small interview room that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, gesturing for us to sit at a scarred wooden table. "Now then," she said, settling into her chair and opening a notepad. "Mr. Martinez, why don't you tell me what brings you here today?" Vincent launched into his carefully prepared speech about discovering his daughter's inappropriate relationship with an older boy. He painted himself as the concerned father who had uncovered a predator's manipulation of his innocent child. His performance was flawless. Righteous anger mixed with paternal protectiveness, exactly what Detective Morrison would expect from a father in this situation. "I see," Detective Morrison said when Vincent finished. "And Rebecca, is what your father is telling me accurate?" This was it. The moment when I could tell the truth, expose Marcus for what he really was, and save Tommy Brennan from a fate he didn't deserve. For a split second, I imagined what it would be like to finally speak honestly about what had been happening in our house. But then I saw Vincent's eyes on me, cold and threatening. I remembered Marcus's hands around my throat, his calm certainty that no one would believe the truth. And I thought about the baby growing inside me. Innocent life that would be destroyed along with everything else if I deviated from the script. "Yes," I whispered, the word barely audible. "It's true." Detective Morrison leaned forward slightly. "Rebecca, I know this might be difficult to talk about, but I need you to tell me about your relationship with this boy, Tommy Brennan. Start from the beginning." So I did. I told her the same lies I told my parents, spinning the elaborate fiction that Marcus had created. I described chance meetings that had never happened, conversations that existed only in forged letters, touches that belonged to a different person entirely. Detective Morrison took notes as I spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions that made my stomach clench with anxiety. But Marcus had prepared me well. For every question she asked, I had an answer that fit the narrative. "And you say this relationship has been going on for several months?" she asked. "Since September," I replied, using the timeline Marcus had established. "And during this time, did Tommy ever pressure you to do things you weren't comfortable with?" "Sometimes," I said, forcing tears into my eyes. "He would say that if I really loved him, I would let him touch me in places I didn't want to be touched." It was horrible how easily the words came, how naturally I could describe manipulation and coercion that I knew all too well, just attributed to the wrong person. Detective Morrison's expression hardened. Rebecca, did Tommy ever touch you inappropriately? I know this is difficult, but I need you to be specific. The room felt like it was closing in around me. This was the moment that would seal Tommy Brennan's fate, that would brand him as a sexual predator, based entirely on my lies. Yes, I whispered. He touched my chest. And other places. He said it was normal, that people who loved each other did these things. Detective Morrison wrote down every word, her pen scratching across the paper like fingernails on a chalkboard. Each note she took was another nail in Tommy's coffin. Did he ever attempt to have sexual intercourse with you? No, I said quickly. I told him I was too scared, and he said he would wait. But he kept pushing, kept saying that maybe next time. Vincent made a disgusted sound from his chair. The sick bastard was grooming her, he said, his voice full of righteous fury. Just waiting for the right moment to destroy my little girl's innocence. If only he knew that his little girl's innocence had been destroyed years ago by his own golden boy son. We'll need to bring Tommy in for questioning, Detective Morrison said, closing her notepad. In the meantime, Rebecca, I want you to know that you did the right thing by coming forward. I know it was scary, but you've probably prevented this from happening to other girls. Other girls. The thought that my lies might somehow be justified by preventing fictional future crimes made me feel even sicker. As we left the police station, Vincent was practically glowing with satisfaction. That went perfectly, he said as we walked to his truck. Morrison bought every word. That little punk is going to learn what happens when you mess with a Martinez. That evening at dinner, Marcus listened to Vincent's recap of our police station visit with what appeared to be brotherly concern. But I caught the satisfied gleam in his dark eyes, the subtle smile that played at the corners of his mouth. Good work, Rebecca, he said when Vincent finished his story. I know that must have been hard for you, but you did the right thing. The praise made me want to vomit. Here was my rapist congratulating me for framing an innocent boy for his crimes. 2 days later, the hammer fell on Tommy Brennan's unsuspecting head. I was in English class when I saw the police cars pull up to the high school through the classroom window. My stomach dropped as I watched Detective Morrison and 2 uniformed officers walk through the front entrance of the building. The word spread through the school like wildfire. By lunch, everyone knew that Tommy Brennan had been arrested for having an inappropriate relationship with a middle school girl. The gossip machine that was typical of any small town was working overtime, with details becoming more lurid with each retelling. I heard he was doing it with some 12-year-old, one girl whispered in the cafeteria line. My mom knows a lady who works at the police station, another girl added. She said they found love letters and everything. Love letters. The forged evidence that Marcus and I had created, now being discussed as proof of Tommy's guilt. I couldn't eat lunch that day. I sat alone at my usual table, picking at a sandwich while listening to my classmates discuss Tommy's arrest with the ghoulish fascination that teenagers reserve for scandals. Each comment, each whispered speculation, felt like another betrayal of the innocent boy whose life was being destroyed by my lies. After school, I couldn't bring myself to go straight home. Instead, I walked to the small park where Tommy had supposedly taken me for some of our fictional romantic meetings. I sat on a bench, watching the November wind scatter dead leaves across the empty playground, and tried to process what I had done. Somewhere across town, Tommy Brennan was probably sitting in a jail cell, confused and terrified, trying to understand why he was being accused of crimes he'd never committed. His family was probably in shock, his few friends were probably abandoning him, and his future was probably disappearing before his eyes. All because I was too weak, too afraid, too trapped to tell the truth about what was really happening in my house. There you are. I turned to see Marcus approaching, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets against the cold. He sat down beside me on the bench, so close that his thigh pressed against mine in a way that made my skin crawl. How are you feeling about today? He asked, his voice carrying false concern. Sick, I answered honestly. Marcus laughed softly. That's just guilt, little sister. It'll pass. You'll see, in a few weeks, when all this dies down, you'll realize that we did what we had to do. We destroyed an innocent person's life. We protected our family, Marcus corrected. We protected you, and we protected the baby. Tommy Brennan was already a screw-up, already heading for trouble. All we did was accelerate the timeline a little. His casual dismissal of Tommy's humanity made my stomach turn. In Marcus's world, other people were just props to be moved around for his convenience, their lives and feelings irrelevant compared to his desires. Besides, Marcus continued, his hand finding my knee and squeezing just hard enough to remind me of his power over me. It's done now. The story is out there, the police believe it, and Tommy's going to pay the price. There's no going back. He was right, and we both knew it. Even if I found the courage to recant my story, who would believe me now? A pregnant 12-year-old claiming that she'd lied to protect her abusive brother? It would look like I was just trying to save my supposed boyfriend from the consequences of his actions. Now, Marcus said, standing up and offering me his hand, let's go home. Mama's making your favorite dinner tonight. She thinks you need comfort food after the stress of dealing with the police. I let him help me up, hating myself for the automatic compliance that years of abuse had beaten into me. As we walked home together, Marcus chatting casually about school and upcoming holidays, I felt like I was walking in a dream, or rather, a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. The next few weeks passed in a blur of whispered conversations and suspicious glances. News of Tommy's arrest had spread throughout our small community, and suddenly, everyone had an opinion about the Martinez family and our brave decision to come forward. I always thought that Brennan boy was trouble, Mrs. Patterson from next door told Carmen over the fence. You can see it in their eyes, you know. Boys like that. Your Rebecca is lucky you found out when you did. I just pray she'll be able to move past this, Carmen replied, playing her part as the concerned mother perfectly. It's so hard when children lose their innocence so young. If only she knew how young I'd really been, when my innocence was stolen. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the first week of December. Vincent announced this news at dinner with the satisfaction of a man watching justice being served. Morrison says it's just a formality, he said, cutting into his steak with aggressive precision. The boy's lawyer is probably going to try to get him to plead guilty to avoid a trial. Save everyone the embarrassment of having to air all the dirty details in open court. I pushed food around my plate, unable to stomach the thought of eating while discussing Tommy's impending destruction. What if he doesn't plead guilty? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. Vincent looked up from his plate, his gray eyes sharp. Then we go to trial, and you testify about everything he did to you. Every inappropriate touch, every manipulation, every time he took advantage of your innocence. The thought of sitting in a courtroom, under oath, and repeating my lies while Tommy sat just feet away listening to his life being destroyed by my false testimony was almost enough to make me break down completely. Don't worry, Mija, Carmen said, reaching over to pat my hand. You won't have to face him alone. We'll all be there to support you. Support. The word was obscene in this context. My family would be there to support me in destroying an innocent person, to ensure that my lies sounded convincing enough to send a boy to prison for crimes he'd never committed. That night, I lay in bed with my hands pressed against my growing belly, feeling the baby move restlessly inside me. The child was getting bigger, more active, a constant reminder of the horrible circumstances of its conception and the web of lies surrounding its existence. 5 months pregnant now, and still no one suspected the truth. The loose clothes and careful posture were still working, but I knew that wouldn't last much longer. Soon, people would start asking questions that would require even more elaborate lies to answer. Marcus had already started preparing for that eventuality. He'd mentioned, casually, that when the time came, we might need to send me away somewhere to have the baby. For your health, he'd said, and for the family's reputation. I suspected that Marcus's plans went far beyond just hiding my pregnancy. There was something in his eyes when he talked about the baby. A possessive gleam that terrified me more than his violence ever had. This child was proof of his complete dominance over me, and I didn't think he was going to be willing to let that proof disappear. But for now, all I could do was lie in the darkness and listen to the wind rattling the windows, knowing that somewhere across town, an innocent boy was probably lying awake too, wondering how his life had gone so wrong so quickly. Tomorrow would bring us one day closer to his trial, one day closer to the moment when I would have to look him in the eyes and destroy him with my lies, and after that, Marcus would move on to the next phase of his plan, whatever that might be. The baby kicked hard against my ribs, as if it too was trying to escape the nightmare we were all trapped in. But there was no escape. Not for any of us. The lies had taken on a life of their own, creating a reality that was just as inescapable as the truth it was designed to hide. I couldn't eat lunch that day. I sat alone at my usual table, picking at a sandwich while listening to my classmates discuss Tommy's arrest with the ghoulish fascination that teenagers reserve for scandals. Each comment, each whispered speculation, felt like another betrayal of the innocent boy whose life was being destroyed by my lies. After school, I couldn't bring myself to go straight home. Instead, I walked to the small park where Tommy had supposedly taken me for some of our fictional romantic meetings. I sat on a bench, watching the November wind scatter dead leaves across the empty playground, and tried to process what I had done. Somewhere across town, Tommy Brennan was probably sitting in a jail cell, confused and terrified, trying to understand why he was being accused of crimes he'd never committed. His family was probably in shock, his few friends were probably abandoning him, and his future was probably disappearing before his eyes. All because I was too weak, too afraid, too trapped to tell the truth about what was really happening in my house. There you are. I turned to see Marcus approaching, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets against the cold. He sat down beside me on the bench, so close that his thigh pressed against mine in a way that made my skin crawl. "How are you feeling about today?" he asked, his voice carrying false concern. "Sick," I answered honestly. Marcus laughed softly. "That's just guilt, little sister. It'll pass. You'll see, in a few weeks, when all this dies down, you'll realize that we did what we had to do. We destroyed an innocent person's life. We protected our family," Marcus corrected. "We protected you, and we protected the baby." Tommy Brennan was already a screw-up, already heading for trouble. All we did was accelerate the timeline a little. His casual dismissal of Tommy's humanity made my stomach turn. In Marcus's world, other people were just props to be moved around for his convenience, their lives and feelings irrelevant compared to his desires. "Besides," Marcus continued, his hand finding my knee and squeezing just hard enough to remind me of his power over me, "it's done now. The story is out there, the police believe it, and Tommy's going to pay the price. There's no going back." He was right, and we both knew it. Even if I found the courage to recant my story, who would believe me now? A pregnant 12-year-old claiming that she'd lied to protect her abusive brother? It would look like I was just trying to save my supposed boyfriend from the consequences of his actions. "Now," Marcus said, standing up and offering me his hand, "let's go home. Mama's making your favorite dinner tonight. She thinks you need comfort food after the stress of dealing with the police." I let him help me up, hating myself for the automatic compliance that years of abuse had beaten into me. As we walked home together, Marcus chatting casually about school and upcoming holidays, I felt like I was walking in a dream, or rather, a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. The next few weeks passed in a blur of whispered conversations and suspicious glances. News of Tommy's arrest had spread throughout our small community, and suddenly, everyone had an opinion about the Martinez family and our brave decision to come forward. "I always thought that Brennan boy was trouble," Mrs. Patterson from next door told Carmen over the fence. "You can see it in their eyes, you know. Boys like that. Your Rebecca is lucky you found out when you did." "I just pray she'll be able to move past this," Carmen replied, playing her part as the concerned mother perfectly. "It's so hard when children lose their innocence so young. If only she knew how young I'd really been, when my innocence was stolen." Vincent stood too, his face darkening with rage. "You won't let us?" "Girl, you seem to have forgotten your place in this family. That baby was conceived in sin and shame, and it's going to bring us nothing but trouble if we keep it." "It's my child," I repeated, backing toward the door. "It's a bastard," Vincent snarled. "And bastards have no place in decent families." The argument escalated from there, with Vincent screaming about family honor and financial security while I tried desperately to protect the one innocent thing in my life. Carmen sat frozen at the table, too afraid to intervene, while Marcus watched the scene with the detached interest of someone observing an experiment. In the end, it didn't matter what I wanted. I was 15 years old, pregnant, and completely dependent on people who saw me as nothing more than a liability to be managed. When I threatened to run away, Vincent reminded me that I had nowhere to go and no resources to survive on my own. When I threatened to tell the truth about Marcus, he reminded me that I'd already committed perjury and could be prosecuted for destroying Tommy Brennan's life with false accusations. I was trapped in every way that mattered. The birth happened on a cold April morning in 1968. Carmen had arranged for a midwife, a woman named Mrs. Rodriguez who asked no questions and left no official records. The labor was long and difficult, made worse by the knowledge that this might be the only time I'd ever hold my child. Me. She was beautiful, perfect tiny fingers, dark hair like mine, and when she opened her eyes for the first time, they were the clearest blue I'd ever seen. Not green like Marcus's, not gray like Vincent's, but blue like the sky on a perfect spring day. "She's gorgeous," Carmen whispered, tears streaming down her face as she helped clean the baby. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman she used to be, the mother who might have protected her grandchild if she'd been stronger. I held my daughter for exactly 6 hours, 6 precious hours of memorizing her face, counting her tiny toes, breathing in that sweet newborn smell that I knew I'd remember for the rest of my life. Marcus came to take her just after sunset. "It's time," he said, standing in the doorway of my bedroom like death itself. "Please," I begged, clutching my daughter tighter, "let me keep her. I'll do anything you want, but please don't take my baby." "The Weatherbees are waiting," Marcus said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "They've already paid half the money. This is happening whether you cooperate or not." Vincent appeared behind him, his face set in stone. "Give him the baby, Rebecca. Now." I looked down at my sleeping daughter, trying to memorize every detail of her perfect face. Then I kissed her forehead and whispered, "I love you. I will always love you." Marcus took her from my arms with no more ceremony than if he were picking up a package. She woke up and started crying, her tiny voice calling for the mother she'd never see again. "Her name is Sarah," I called out as Marcus walked away. Please tell them her name is Sarah." He didn't respond. He just walked out of the house with my daughter, taking her to strangers who had bought her like property. I screamed until my voice gave out. I cried until there were no tears left. And when the sun rose the next morning, I was alone in my bed, my arms empty, my heart shattered beyond repair. The $50,000 changed everything for the Martinez family. Vincent quit his job at the steel plant and bought a small business. Carmen got new furniture and clothes for the first time in years. Marcus used his share to buy a car and start making plans for college. And me? I got to pretend that none of it had ever happened. The official story was that I'd miscarried due to stress from the trauma of my relationship with Tommy Brennan. The community rallied around our family, offering sympathy and support for our tragic loss. No one questioned why I wasn't grieving the way they expected, or why I seemed more angry than sad. I never saw my daughter again. I don't know what happened to the Weatherbees, whether they kept the name Sarah or whether they loved her the way she deserved to be loved. For over 50 years, I've lived with the knowledge that somewhere out there is a woman who might be my child, who might have children of her own, who might wonder sometimes about the mother who gave her away. Tommy Brennan was released from juvenile detention in 1969. He left Riverside immediately and never came back. I heard he moved to Oregon, changed his name, and tried to build a new life. I hope he found peace. I hope he found happiness. I hope he never knew that his life was destroyed to cover up someone else's crimes. As for me, I left home on my 18th birthday and never looked back. I moved to Phoenix, built a quiet life, and spent decades in therapy trying to process what had been done to me and what I'd been forced to do to others. Marcus became a successful businessman, married a nice girl from a good family, and had 3 children of his own. I've often wondered if he ever touched them the way he touched me, if his legacy of abuse continued into the next generation. I hope not, but I've learned not to have much faith in hope. Vincent died of a heart attack in 1985, taking his secrets to the grave. Carmen lived until 1998, spending her final years in a nursing home, often talking to nurses about the granddaughter she'd lost to miscarriage. I think, in her failing mind, she'd convinced herself that version of events was true. I never married. I never had other children. How could I, knowing what I knew about family, about the monsters that can hide behind familiar faces? But I survived. Against all odds, despite everything that was done to me and everything I was forced to do, I survived. And if there's a young girl out there listening to this story, trapped in her own nightmare of family secrets and hidden abuse, I want her to know this. It's not your fault. Whatever they're doing to you, whatever they're making you do, it's not your fault. Hepashatsam. You can survive this. You can build a life beyond the horror. You can find peace, even if you can never find justice. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and this is my story. It's a story I've carried alone for over 50 years, but I'm sharing it now because silence protects the monsters, not the victims. Somewhere out there is a daughter I held for 6 hours and loved for a lifetime. If you're listening, Sarah, if you're out there, know that you were wanted. Know that you were loved. Know that not a day has passed that I haven't thought of you and wondered if you're happy. And know that your mother survived, and in surviving, found the strength to finally tell the truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.